If Constantinople had fallen in the year 718, the Europe we know would have vanished. Not changed, not delayed, erased. For centuries, we were told that Europe was saved at Tours. A single day, a single clash. But Tours was only a moment. Constantinople was 13 months, and it was the real gate. In the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate stood at the height of its power, stretching across 3 continents, advancing faster than any empire before it. To them, Constantinople was not just another city. It was the lock on Europe. In the summer of 717, an army numbering in the tens of thousands crossed into Thrace. Behind it followed a fleet so vast that even the chroniclers struggled to describe its scale. Ahead stood one city, scarred by civil war, ruled by an emperor barely months on the throne. No heroic charge waited here. No open battlefield. Only walls, fire, and time. 2 lines of Umayyad fortifications rose around the city. The fleet pushed into the Bosporus, and Constantinople closed its gates, silent, waiting. So here is the question that history rarely asks. How does an army this powerful lose, without ever fighting a decisive battle in the open? Stay with me, because what happened here was not a defeat. It was the slow death of an imperial system. To understand why Constantinople stood alone, we have to look at the world closing in around it. In the year 636, Byzantine forces were crushed by advancing Arab armies at the Battle of Yarmouk. Syria was lost to those same forces. Jerusalem followed soon after, captured in 637. By 642, Egypt, the empire's primary source of grain, had fallen as well. From there, the collapse accelerated. Arab armies surged west across North Africa, capturing ports and cities one by one. At the same time, other Umayyad forces pushed east, absorbing the lands of the former Persian Empire. Within a single generation, the Umayyad Caliphate stretched from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the frontiers of Central Asia. No empire in the early medieval world had ever expanded this fast. This was not a series of isolated wars. It was a continuous forward motion, driven by momentum. And directly in its path stood Constantinople. The city sat astride 2 narrow waterways, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, the maritime throat between Asia and Europe. Every army, every fleet, every supply route moving between the 2 continents passed within reach of its walls. Constantinople was not simply a capital, it was a military hub, an administrative center, and a political and religious symbol, all at once. If Constantinople fell, the Byzantine Empire would not retreat. It would disintegrate. And beyond Constantinople, no power stood ready to replace the Byzantine state. The Balkans were thinly defended. The kingdoms farther north were fragmented and underpopulated. There was no unified force waiting behind the city. Yet the Umayyad advance reached Constantinople at the very moment Byzantium was weakest. The empire had just endured what historians call the 20 years of anarchy. Emperors were overthrown in rapid succession. Civil wars drained the treasury and shattered loyalty. Leo III took the throne only months before the Umayyad armies appeared. He faced the most powerful expansionist empire on earth, at a moment when Byzantium was least prepared to resist. Centuries later, the Battle of Tours would be remembered as a turning point. But Tours was a frontier clash, limited in scale, limited in purpose. Constantinople, in 717, was something else entirely. It was an all-or-nothing attempt to break the center of the Byzantine world. And if Constantinople fell, there would be no one left standing between the Umayyad Caliphate and Europe. What followed was not simply a clash of armies, but a collision between two completely different systems of war. The Umayyad campaign was built for speed. Their objective was direct and uncompromising. Take Constantinople, break the Byzantine state, and end the war in a single decisive stroke. They brought overwhelming numbers, hardened by decades of continuous campaigning. They brought a powerful fleet, designed to isolate the city and force its surrender from the sea. But this kind of war carried a hidden cost. A massive army consumes enormous supplies. A vast fleet depends on uninterrupted transport, disciplined crews, and confidence at sea. The longer the campaign lasted, the more fragile the Umayyad system became. Their war demanded momentum. If Constantinople did not fall quickly, the balance would begin to turn against them. Leo III understood this. He refused to meet the Umayyads in open battle. There would be no heroic charge outside the walls. No attempt to break the siege with a single risky engagement. Instead, Leo chose time. He ordered food stockpiled inside the city, enough for a long endurance. The defenses were organized by sector and rotation, ensuring the walls were never undermanned. Gates, storehouses, and patrol routes were refined into a single defensive system. At sea, Leo relied on a weapon that was as psychological as it was physical: Greek fire. It did not need to destroy the Umayyad fleet. It only needed to prove that the fleet was never truly safe. At the same time, Leo secured what the walls alone could not provide: diplomacy. By allying with Tervel of Bulgaria, the Byzantines created a second front, one that the Umayyad army could not ignore. The besiegers would soon find themselves exposed not only to the city ahead, but to enemies behind. This was the quiet asymmetry of the siege. The Umayyads needed a rapid victory. The Byzantines needed only to endure. One side fought to win quickly. The other fought to let time do the killing. The siege began in the heat of summer. In July of 717, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik led his army across the Hellespont. They marched onto European soil and closed around Constantinople from the landward side. Trenches were dug, fortifications rose. Supply routes were organized with the confidence of an army expecting a short war. At sea, the Umayyad fleet moved into the Bosporus to complete the encirclement. Inside the city, the gates were sealed. No counterattack came. No banners moved on the walls. Constantinople answered the invasion with silence. That silence did not last. When Umayyad transport ships began to lag behind their warships, Leo III acted. Byzantine vessels surged forward, not to fight a pitched naval battle, but to strike once and withdraw. Greek fire erupted across the water. Only a small number of ships were destroyed, but the effect was catastrophic. The flame burned on the sea itself. Sailors panicked. Formation collapsed. From that moment on, the Umayyad fleet kept its distance from the walls. The siege turned inward. Weeks passed, then months. The Umayyad army consumed vast amounts of food. Foraging parties were sent farther and farther from the camp. Byzantine patrols, and soon Bulgarian raiders, began cutting them down. Disease spread. Morale eroded. The war became a grinding loop of hunger, fear, and exhaustion. Then winter arrived. Contemporary sources describe it as unusually brutal. Snow covered the ground for months. Temperatures plunged. The Umayyad soldiers, unprepared for the climate, began to die in large numbers. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Arab chroniclers and Byzantine historians alike record acts of desperation inside the camp. Inside Constantinople, food remained. The blockade at sea had failed. In the spring of 718, relief finally came, or so it seemed. 2 Umayyad fleets arrived from Egypt and North Africa, carrying reinforcements and supplies. But many of the sailors were Christian conscripts. According to Byzantine sources, some defected, bringing intelligence about the besieging army. Leo III struck again. Using this information, Byzantine ships destroyed much of the remaining Umayyad fleet with Greek fire. At the same time, Byzantine forces attacked the reinforcements in Anatolia. Then the trap closed. Tervel of Bulgaria unleashed his army against the Umayyad rear. The besiegers were now trapped between the city they could not take and enemies they could not escape. By August of 718, Maslama had no choice. The order to retreat was given. On land, Bulgarian attacks continued. At sea, Byzantine harassment followed the fleeing fleet. Then storms finished what war had begun. Most of the Umayyad ships were lost before reaching Syria. The greatest expedition the Caliphate had ever launched collapsed without a final battle. When the siege ended, the result was unmistakable. The Umayyad Caliphate had failed. Constantinople still stood. The walls remained intact. The city's defensive system had survived its greatest test. For the Umayyads, the consequences were severe. The expedition had been designed to end the Byzantine Empire in a single campaign. Instead, it ended with the destruction of most of the invading force. Not in one decisive battle, but through hunger, disease, exposure, ambush, and collapse during retreat. Contemporary sources offer different numbers, and none can be treated as precise. What they agree on is scale. Tens of thousands did not return. This was not a battlefield annihilation. It was the failure of an entire war system, one that could not sustain itself once momentum was lost. For the Byzantines, survival became consolidation. Leo III emerged from the siege not as a disputed ruler, but as a proven defender of the empire. The victory stabilized the throne and marked the beginning of the Isaurian dynasty. Beyond the walls, the balance shifted as well. Bulgaria, under Khan Tervel, had demonstrated its ability to shape events south of the Danube. Its role in the siege elevated it from a regional power to a decisive actor in the Balkans. The immediate outcome was clear. One empire had tried to end a war in a year and failed. The other had endured and gained time. Europe was not saved in a single day a tour. Europe was saved by a city that refused to fall for 13 months. If Constantinople had collapsed in 718, the consequences would have been immediate. The Byzantine state would have ceased to exist. The Balkan corridor and the Danube frontier would have been left open, with no organized power capable of stopping further expansion into southeastern Europe. But the city held. After 718, the Umayyad Caliphate never again attempted a direct assault on Constantinople. The largest expedition it had ever launched had failed. Its momentum was broken, not by one battle, but by a system that refused to collapse. This is why many modern historians place the siege of 717 to 718 alongside Marathon and Salamis. Not because the battles were similar, but because the stakes were. Each marked the moment when a single geographic choke point stopped a vastly larger force and redirected the course of Western history. The siege leaves behind 4 enduring lessons. Geography can defeat numbers. Constantinople did not win by expanding outward, but by anchoring itself to the narrowest point of the straits. Logistics are the true limit of ambition, and diplomacy can decide where that limit is reached. By securing Bulgarian intervention at the critical moment, Leo III ensured that Umayyad supply lines were not only eroded by hunger and winter, but struck by enemies who understood precisely when to attack. The weather is never neutral. The winter of 717 to 718 became an unplanned ally that no army could command. And technology, when paired with psychology, can paralyze power. Greek fire did not destroy fleets. It destroyed certainty. Constantinople survived not by triumph, but by endurance, timing, and choice. And sometimes, history is not changed by those who advance the farthest, but by those who refuse to fall. If you value history that strips legend down to evidence, stay with the channel. And tell us in the comments, which other battle, in your view, locked or unlocked a door of history?